STEMology, the Young Scientist Survival Guide, Session 33. Welcome, STEMologists. It's your favorite mediocre podcast host, Alina Adams. So this is a really special episode to me, and it's been in the works for a few months now, actually, and I'm very proud to finally present it to you all. But first, I'd love to graciously welcome Dr. Theodore White to the STEMology podcast this afternoon. It's wonderful that we were finally able to find time to get together and record this podcast episode for all of you wonderful STEM students who are interested in expanding your knowledge, find out more about what STEM has to offer. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure. My name is Ted White. I come from Upper New York State, from a working class family. I went to Cornell University where I did some STEM research in biology and took a class on microbes. And that class inspired me to go to graduate school to continue to work on microbes, and got my PhD at the University of Michigan. And then my research interest took me to Amsterdam, where I worked at the Netherlands Cancer Institute for a few years. When I came back from Amsterdam, I worked at the University of California at San Francisco, again working on the same sort of microbes. At that point, I moved a little bit into microbes that cause disease in AIDS patients. And I've really been working on these yeasts and molds for the last 30 years, at various aspects of yeasts and molds for the last 30 years. Moving to Seattle, where I became a professor for 15 years, and now I've been dean of the School of Biological and Chemical Sciences at UMKC for the last 10 years.
Wow, very impressive. That's awesome. So hopefully, students, you'll be able to learn something from this episode. And I decided to call it Becoming a Scientist because there is a point, as Dr. White mentioned, where you become very inspired and you see something or an aspect of science or read something, hear someone talk, and then you think, wow, like that's super cool. I am truly honored that you were able to lend your voice and experiences to students across the globe. So thank you for being here. This is going to be a great episode. There are a few different things that come to mind whenever students think scientist. It might be crazy white hair, Albert Einstein, lab coats, computer screens. Sometimes that's true.
Yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of scientists out there. From my current postdoc, a woman who got her PhD with me and has stayed with me as a postdoc, is a runner who runs incredible amounts every week, like a marathon every week. She's a little bit obsessive about that.
Yeah.
I've had people who are obsessed with video games, who were postdocs, grad students who were involved in everything from ice skating to a world-class female judo expert is now a professor at the University of Delaware. So
that's really cool. See, you can do your own thing. You can have a life. You can have hobbies outside of science. Scientist is a job less than it is a personality trait, or it can be.
Well, science is not a 9-to-5 job. It is you have to have a passion, and then you have to be willing to put the time in, and that could be going in on a Sunday night to start some cultures so you can analyze them during the day on Monday. I will say, though, that as you work through your career, the time you put in equals the rewards. And so, if you were too busy with outside activities, then your career to a PhD is going to get spread out. A lot of people have, families while they're being a scientist. I had 2 PhDs who were both male, and they were both married, and they both wives got pregnant while these students were doing their PhDs.
So you can still have a life. You can still do all those things you'd like to do. You can still travel, form relationships. So we are here to set the record straight, if you will, about what it is to be a scientist, the life that you could possibly lead. And luckily, we do have a real-life scientist here.
I guess that's true, absolutely.
So, Dr. White, because I am speaking for the average student who might still be on the fence about whether or not they'd like to become a STEM major, they might want to know so many different things about what life is like after graduating from undergrad. So let's answer some questions.
Okay.
So you mentioned that you were doing AIDS research and studying these different microbes and molds. So is that your current research right now, or was that in the past?
It is. So in undergrad, I took a course in microbes with a nucleus. So yeast and molds and some parasites. And from that course, I went into my PhD work on that. I went to Amsterdam to work on parasites. I came back to San Francisco to work on parasites. And that was at the start of the AIDS epidemic. And at that point, a lot of people were getting fungal infections. So I shifted from parasites to fungi. But I've continued my interest in everything that is some single-celled organisms that have a nucleus but cause disease.
Do you see yourself moving in this direction until retirement?
Well, I am getting up there in years, and so retirement may not be too far away. But throughout the career, I followed my nose. I followed what was interesting and what was important. So I did that switch to AIDS research with the fungi. I was particularly interested in drug resistance in those fungi because AIDS patients were taking a lot of drug and developing resistance, and then you had to treat in a different way. And so the focus for the last 30 years has been on various aspects of drug resistance.
Wow. So what led you to academia then? When did you decide to become a professor?
I'm not sure that decision was a conscious decision.
You just kind of funneled that way and went with it?
Well, it was clear I did not want to be a physician, seeing patients 5 days a week or more. And I was clearly interested in research from my middle school days when a very influential teacher talked to me about DNA and RNA and protein and transcription and translation. And when I heard that, I became very interested. And partly I know now that she was teaching things that were very current. They were recent discoveries at that time, and yet I was learning about them in middle school.
Yeah, science moves very quickly.
It does. And the fact that what she was teaching was very current. So I went into undergrad. I was interested in that science, and I did 2 sort of internships with professors at Cornell. One of them was very unsuccessful. I didn't really know what I was doing. The second one, we discovered something that last I knew that faculty member could never explain the results that I got, but I created a mutant and he couldn't understand the mutant. I think if we go back 40, 50 years later, 45 years later maybe, we could probably figure out what was going on, but back then we didn't know what was. So then I went to graduate school and became interested in the science. So it wasn't so much the choice of academics versus industry. It was the choice of the science versus some other career path. And it was about the science. And so when you know you want to be a scientist, the question is, what are your options? And there's lots of options. Yes, you can go into academics, but there's lots of layers to that. You could go into a medical school and do research in a medical school. You could do research in an undergraduate school. And so at UMKC, there's researchers in the medical school, the pharmacy school, the dental school, as well as researchers in the undergraduate department.
Yeah, we always need to be working towards finding solutions and solving the many questions that there are.
Absolutely. So you could be a researcher in a medical school, a researcher just at someone who teaches undergrads as well. Mm-hmm. You could go to a small college where it's mostly teaching and not a lot of research. You could go into industry, big industry like Pfizer or Merck. You can go into small industry, little biotechs that are trying to develop one little drug and maybe either sell it to the big pharmaceuticals or try and make it as a drug on their own. You can go into law, into patent law. You can go into science journalism. You know, if you write well, there's that area. If you like to argue, you know, law and science, you can combine those. You can go into nonprofits like the Gates Foundation that, you know, tries to get vaccines to the world. they've got a lot of other programs, but that's what.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that you are mentioning all these different aspects of science. So you don't have to do bench work. You don't have to go into specific drug developments like in biotechs and things like that. There are many different ways to use your science degrees.
And it isn't just, okay, you're going to be a biologist or you're going to be a chemist or you're going to be an engineer. So you can combine biology and engineering for artificial limbs, artificial hearing. You need both engineering expertise and biological expertise to develop all sorts of prosthetics.
That's a special interest of mine, actually. So these are some of the lesser known benefits of becoming a scientist, is all these different networks and collaborations and working between different groups. So like you said, you don't have to only be a biologist, but if you are, you could work with a chemist, you could work with someone from another field. And that's where most of the really great things that are happening are born between different collaborations like that.
I would agree. I think that there is the idea of a scientist is his or her lab in a university, shut away, and that doesn't work. It hasn't worked in decades. What you need to do is to collaborate, to communicate, to make connections so that all the parts are together are greater than everybody working independently.
Yeah. And you've had some really great travel experiences from those networks and collaborations too.
So one of my collaborators is from New Zealand, and he had me visit New Zealand for a few weeks and actually took me to Queensland, where a lot of the scenery from Lord of the Rings was filmed. So he worked down near there, and so I visited him, and we collaborated, and I gave a talk. Another collaborator was in New Delhi, and so I visited New Delhi and saw the Taj Mahal, and I've been to India. As I said, I've spent 3 years in Amsterdam, scientific meetings around the world. Thailand, I spent a week in Thailand teaching a course with some people from Australia. I've been to Australia.
Wow.
You can travel a lot as part of the being a scientist, and that's whether you're in industry or academics or any other thing. Of course, now with COVID, travel is severely restricted, and so some of the meetings we all go to as scientists, all the fungal people go to, those meetings are being redesigned as Zoom meetings, and we will get the information, but we won't get the networking that's important. Go out for dinner or go out for a drink and with really your colleagues.
Form those relationships.
Or just talk, and new ideas come from just talking over a drink or over a meal.
Mm-hmm. That's
I
awesome.
want to mention, we talked about engineering and biology. There's another thing that is growing, and that is data analysis. If you like math or if you like computers, the merger of biology and computers is called bioinformatics. And there's a lot going on right now with that. Learning to look at huge data sets. You can't just handle it with an Excel sheet. It's like questioning, like Cerner here in Kansas City has, 100 million patient records that they can take the patient information away, but you can ask how many people got diabetes, how many people had heart disease, what was their distribution around the country. You can do all that with sort of huge data sets like Cerner's.
That's amazing. That is really cool. So I want to talk a little bit about students now and what they can do to start rethinking of themselves as a scientist and start filling those shoes, because I think one of the hardest parts is to get students into science, but how do we keep them there once they decide to be a scientist? So what do you think that students can do now, today, to begin to think of themselves in that role as a scientist and try to develop an aptitude for the field?
So let's start with high school students. So if you're in high school, if you really want to do research, the opportunity to show up at a research lab and say, hey, I wouldn't mind working for you for free to get some experience.
Volunteering, just seeing what you do.
Now, you might wind up washing scientific dishes, but you're also a pair of hands that can be easily taught to do some experiments. So for instance, we've had high school students occasionally. One of them a few years ago did some work that will be part of a publication, and he went off to Johns Hopkins as a pre-med student from being a high school student. Those opportunities are there for high school students. When you're an undergrad, I would say that the first year you need to focus on getting settled in an undergrad situation. The type of class, the type of exams are going to be different from high school, and you need to be ready for that transition.
It doesn't sound like there's really a downside to doing that, especially if you do have higher education goals.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, my lab is set up so that where you do the experiments is one part, and there is an area where I have desks and computers, and students can then sit there and work for their exam or whatever. I've taken undergrads to meetings. Most recently, I took two undergrads in my postdoc to a meeting in Iowa City, Iowa. When I was in Seattle, I took students to national meetings if they were sort of within the United States or Canada.
Incredible experience as an undergrad to get. Typically don't see those things until you're a little older. But I really like your point of hanging out in the lab, studying there, just being around like-minded individuals. You pick up on hopefully good habits, good study habits, good lab habits that you can carry on throughout your career too. How do you think that students view scientists versus the actual realization of what a scientist is and who they are, what they do? And how do we sort of bridge the two together?
Science today is all about collaboration. It's all about diversity. It's people balancing their interest in science, their family life. For example, an undergrad came to me because he really loved music, but he also loved biology. And he didn't know what to do with grad school, whether he wanted to go to grad school in biology or music. And I said, well, why don't you explore both, combine the two? And so he went off, and he's at Berkeley now as a graduate student studying hearing and music and the biology of hearing.
Wow.
As associated with music. And he can deal with, or he's involved with both of his passions.
Mm-hmm.
So I would argue, take 2 or 3 passions and combine them and see what you can do with it.
That's awesome. That's really cool. All right. I had a quick question for you about students again. So what would you say to a high school student who is currently preparing to enter a STEM field? I had a few thoughts. I think that students should understand that STEM majors are a little more difficult than others. Exams creep up pretty quickly if you're not keeping an eye on your calendar and staying on top of it. Studying after every lecture, reviewing your notes, things like that, studying early is going to be your best bet. I think that getting active and involved with different programs and clubs and organizations and activities is going to be very helpful to keep your social life and your mental health in check. Another one is to network early and often. And then the last one is pretty important to me. I think that low test scores happen, and they're going to happen. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you aren't smart enough or not good enough and things like that. It's very important to move forward. So understand what went wrong, where there was a gap in your studying, what doesn't work for you, and then adjust and fix it and move on. So those are my top few. Did you have any that you wanted to add?
I would agree with you that your undergraduate career is going to be very different from your high school career, and it is going to be a transition. And so the first semester, maybe even the second semester, don't spend a lot of time on extracurricular activities. It's good to start networking, but focus on making sure you understand how how the university works.
Have a good foundation.
Good foundation, good grades, and then you know how much time you have in January. If you started in September, you know in January where you have some extra
Absolutely.
time.
That's a good.
So I would argue restraint, get settled, get on the ball, start getting good grades early, and then add to it a research internship, extracurricular activities. All of that can be helpful.
That makes sense. That's good advice to make sure that you understand what's going on. You can handle the class load, because classes only get harder. You're only going to find that you have less and less time as you figure out your schedule. And
networking is important, not just to find who else wants to go out to a football game or whatever, but to form a study group to review your notes. Some people have strength in note taking. Some people have strengths in seeing the big picture, take all the facts together and see the overall picture.
That's kind of full circle back around to picking your friends and a lab and things like that, where you are advancing and finding how to be best prepared and things like that. I wanted to summarize real quick. I think that sometimes science is heavily swayed by societal thoughts and different comprehension, and this affects what researchers study and the direction that science is being pulled in. There are also many different companies to work for. So if you find that once you graduate, you're somewhere where you don't quite fit in or you're not happy, there are always going to be other opportunities and something that fits a little better for you.
Don't settle. If you're unhappy in a situation, it's time to move on.
And if there is an area of research that inspires you, 100% pursue it. And then the last note that I had is that there will always be a need for scientists, and there will always be a place for you if you want it. So if you're on the fence about deciding whether or not to become a STEM major, or if you're trying to decide what to do with your life, just try it.
Follow your passion. Don't be afraid to change direction. Don't be afraid to go from a biologist to an engineer or vice versa.
Absolutely.
Your skill set can be used in any field that you choose to go in.
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Dr. White, for being here. I really appreciate you giving some time and talking to the students. I hope we get a few more future scientists out of this podcast. If only one, that was the goal. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
In the next episode of Stemology, we are introducing the 6th episode in the Pre-Med Prep series. Emma and I will both be present, of course, but we will have a third, very important member joining us in the conversation surrounding your personal statement writing process and the nerve-wracking interview preparation. Dr. Tammy Welchert returns to assist Emma and I in considering some of the most imperative aspects of your application into medical school. These two topics very well make or break your acceptance and eventual matriculation. So help me help you by tuning in next Sunday at 12 p.m. You all are the reason that the Stemology podcast continues on, so I love making this content for you every week. Thank you for listening to our 33rd episode of Stemology, the Young Scientist Survival Guide. Tune in with me, Alina Adams, for episode 34, Pre-Med Prep number 6. See you next time.